So we might go ahead and kick off with our third and final session in our speaker series on social imagination. So as we kick off the session, I would like to pause and invite everybody on the call to take a moment and just acknowledge the country that we're calling in from. For myself, that's unceded Wurundjeri country, and it is a beautiful, almost clear, cloudy, rainy. It's both. It's Melbourne. It likes to change it up. um, almost end of wombat season, and I would like to invite you in whatever way feels right for you to take a moment to acknowledge the country and what that means to you to be on country and calling in and for us to be having this conversation today. I'd like to pay my respects and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are with us on the call and in the audience, and to honor and pay respects to elders past and present. It's great to see people putting in the chat where you're calling in from. Really appreciate that, and it's amazing to see everyone calling in. Welcome from Spain. Welcome from Boolaroo. Hi all. Good to see you out there. As we've started each of these sessions, we've been opening by acknowledging 65,000 years of continuous culture that was here before just the last couple generations of settlers. And so, in acknowledging this, Perry and I have had a few conversations about how do we actually start a session about social imagination while honoring the really real injustices and acts of colonization and displacement and violence that have been committed and are being committed to this day in a way that is respectful, but also getting ready to move us collectively into a space where we feel like we're able to talk about things like imagination and cultivating possibility. And so in this final session, we wanted to bring in something by Stan Grant. And this is from his most recent annual reconciliation lecture. That was about a month and a half ago now. We'll send a link to the full address. You should definitely watch it as a follow-up to our talk today. So Stan Grant, for those of you who don't know, is an acclaimed Australian journalist and a television presenter and a Wiradjuri man. And as part of his address, he speaks about how these Western conceptions of time and the ways of making sense of history that we have now are much more linear and shallow and frankly unimaginative compared to the deeper understanding and entanglement with past and future that existed pre-colonization. And he describes history as modernity's disenchanted answer to the magical mystery of time. You need to hear him speak about it. It's moving and brilliant. But he describes how this narrow and kind of definitive version of history actually constrains possibility, and particularly for Australians grappling with this history of colonization, he urges us to peer beyond the horizon. And so social imagination, to me at least, is partially about peering beyond the horizon collaboratively and collectively towards more just and equitable ways of being in this world together. And like Hannah and Ruth shared in the first session, if imagination is the soil that ideas can grow in, then social imagination asks us to get curious about which ideas are thriving and how we might cultivate soil where more just and equitable ideas and imaginaries can thrive. And that is why we're going to hear from these amazing speakers today who do just that, and bring the practices and the ethics to life in ways that are so exciting and so necessary in these times. And I can't wait to hear more about them. So maybe selfishly, even Perry and I are going to kind of breeze through some more introductions, and we're going to have lots of time to hear from our speakers. So I'm Allie. I'm a senior program manager at the Center for Public Impact. We're a global not-for-profit that's trying to reimagine government so that it works better for everyone. And in Australia and New Zealand, that looks like partnering with folks that work within or alongside government so that we can think systemically, work experientially, and embrace complexity, and really importantly, build relationships to continuously learn and adapt alongside the people that government's trying to serve. And hopefully imagine how things might be otherwise and take steps towards that. Which is why we're very excited to be hosting this series along with Third Story. And I'll hand it to Perry to speak a little bit more about the work that y'all are doing and to frame the session a bit more.
Thanks so much, Ali, and welcome everyone. I'm also here on Wurundjeri country and would like to pay my respects to elders past and present and to First Nations colleagues that are joining us today. So as Ali mentioned, I'm from an organisation called Third Story. I'm a director here. Some of you might have known us as our previous name Innovation Unit. We're a partner for social innovation and change. And we've been operating in Australia for about 10 years, but are quite new to the Melbourne context. We've been here for 2 years. And we work locally and internationally to imagine new possibilities and build conditions for social impact at scale. And our work typically involves collaboration, endeavouring to do that well, between communities, government services, and other partners, usually with ideas behind it around growing new propositions and working together to realise them. We've been thinking about social imagination for a little while, Ali and I, Third Story and Centre for Public Impact. We've had a shared interest in the disciplines and practices that will help us to imagine and move collectively towards better futures. We know how important that work is and how hard it can be. So we know we want to build much more interest in giving space and support to social imagination practice, and to work out, learn together how we do it and how we can shape change based on, much more creative, collective imagination. And through this series, we wanted to build relationships between people already working in this space. So we know that there are lots of folk doing really interesting work, and we've wanted to bring some of those folk together so that we can learn and have conversations about what that work looks like. And this is the third in our series. The first session that we had was very foundational and was about what is social imagination anyway. The second session was about how do we fund and commission social imagination at scale. So in all those sessions, we've been thinking about the value that this can bring and how we do the work. Tonight's conversation asks a slightly different question. Whose imagination are we living in? I think we all are really drawn to this question and love this question because it hints at actually the depth of work that is required for social imagination to really give us what we want and to kind of move us towards where we want to go. And in order to run this session, I want to introduce Morgan Cataldo, who's going to facilitate the session and introduce our other fabulous speakers, Tasha and Alba. It's really hard to introduce Morgan because I know her quite well and I think she's so fabulous that it's really like a standard bio just doesn't quite cut it. But Morgan runs a company called morgan&co that is dedicated to translating lived expertise into system change and impact. She works with all kinds of different organisations, NGOs, government departments, philanthropic funders, and helping them to understand the value and the purpose of lived expertise and how to work with it in considered, intentional ways. I think Morgan brings so many different kinds of gifts to her work. She brings really high vision for a more just and compassionate world. She brings great care for human beings in work and life. She has a real talent for shifting hearts and minds, and she manages to combine the two things that are really hard to combine, but are so brilliant when they're combined, pragmatism and poetry. I'll just leave that out there. Please welcome Morgan. I'd love to hand over to you now.
Oh, that's so nice. Can you write that down and send it to me? I don't think I've ever been introduced like that. That's so beautiful. Thank you, thank you. Um, Really, really grateful to be here. And this is, it's always so beautiful when you finally get to a point of something happening and conversations between myself and Perry, all that time ago. I think it was last year sometime where we were just so excited about this idea of radical imagination and then realizing that Innovation Union at the time, but Third Story now, and CPI were going to be putting something on. It was just like, oh, this is dreamy that I get to even be able to think about this or talk about this as part of the work that I do. So it's such a gift that you've given us, Perry and Ali, and everybody behind you, who I'm sure has been working on this for a really long time. So thank you so much for that lovely introduction. So, hi everybody. I can't see you, so I'm just going to sort of say hello. Um, we're going to be talking about whose social imagination we're living in today. And before I introduce these two brilliant other people alongside me, I want to do a little bit of framing about what we actually mean here, because we had some sessions talking about, well, how do we want to sort of frame the session up front? And I think anything like social imagination or that kind of question can actually come across as quite confronting because it's like, what does it mean? It feels really abstract. What are we talking about? And for those of us sort of thinking about imagination as part of our activism or our work every day, I think we can take for granted that sometimes we just need to get a really common understanding of some of these things. So the quote that Ali put in the description, you might have seen in the invite where you registered, there was one in there from Asia Marie Brown, who's someone that I've always loved the work of for many, many years. I'm sure some of you are familiar with her. She's written many books now, but one of them is called Emergent Strategy, if anybody would like to go and get a copy and hasn't heard of it, because it's really quite beautiful. But she has this one quote, and we've just got a little bit of a bigger quote, so it's a much bigger quote, but she has this one part, and I think it's a really beautiful way to ground us in what this concept actually means when we think about it in practice. So she says, imagination gives us borders, gives us superiority, gives us race as an indicator of ability. I often feel I am trapped inside someone else's capability. I often feel I am trapped inside someone else's imagination, and I must engage my own imagination in order to break free. And so the context in which she comes to us there, she's American, but also she's a woman of color. And so she's talking about obviously race there is an indicator of ability. But the two bits that really stood out to me there around what we're going to be talking about tonight is how imagination can both give us borders, but we also have to engage our own imagination to break those borders at the same time. So we're going to be talking about what does that actually mean to have all these different borders around the ways that we just show up in the world and the ways in which we consider things to be either normal or not normal, or on the margins or in the center in a dominant system and considered acceptable. So that's all the stuff that we're going to be sort of fleshing out today. So the three questions that we're not going to answer explicitly, but it'll be woven throughout the entire session. There's sort of these three framing questions that Perry's going to put in the chat for us. And you as the audience might also like to just sit with these and sort of let them percolate with you as we're talking. So the first is about how do we even think about imagination? So what shapes it? What might it have the power to shape and return? How do boundaries, histories, and possibilities expand or limit what we can imagine, both individually and collectively? The second question is about what does it mean to hold a worldview that's considered to challenge dominant ideas about the way things are? So, how do these so-called disruptive perspectives unsettle the consensus and who benefits from that consensus? So, that's sort of when we think about that's not how things are done around here, which I'm sure many of us have been told at some point in our life in some way or another. And then the third question that we're coming around is how can we reveal, challenge, and reimagine the collective imagination that upholds systems of injustice? So, what strategies, stories, or practices help shift what is seen as normal, inevitable, or unchangeable? So, if we think about this sort of word of frame, what are the things that are considered in frame and the things that are considered outside of the frame, and who gets to decide about that? So, those are some of the things we're going to be reflecting on. And we'd love you to reflect on them too, because we're going to have some Q&A at the end. So before I introduce the wonderful speakers and just the ways in which we're grappling with some of these questions ourselves in our practice, we also wanted to share with you a bit of an embodiment prompt for the audience. So Ali's going to put this one in the chat. So, I think when we're listening or in any sort of panel, we take things, all take information in such different ways through many different lenses of knowing and listening and all these sorts of things. But we often don't think about how the body takes in information because often we are quite disconnected from the body in our busy day-to-day lives. So we wanted to sort of invite you to, as you're listening to what we're talking about tonight, just notice how your body responds as you listen. Stay with curiosity. So are there any sensations arising? Does anything shift for you? Does anything open? Does anything tense? And only if it feels comfortable. So, as with everything that we say and do here, this is an invitation, it's not a demand. As we're speaking, we're not telling you what to do and how to do. We're just sort of discussing the ways that we do things, and we'll probably end up with a lot more questions than we have any answers for anything. Um, And I guess what we're saying is with that embodiment prompt, we're trying to draw on both the head and the heart here. So not just intellect or emotion in isolation, but the interplay between both. So just let things land for you where they land. But maybe part of that is the invitation to see how they've landed for you in your body when we come to the Q&A. So that's our framing. So now I get to just be really excited and not so overly focused and introduce two of my absolute favorite people in the world. So I feel very lucky to be able to introduce both Alba and Tasha. Now, I'm only going to do a very short introduction and then hand over to them to do their own introduction because it doesn't really feel fair for me to introduce who they are. It's who they are from my perspective. So I'm going to start with Alba. So Alba and I actually don't know how long we've known each other for, Alba, so maybe you can clear that up. But Alba and I really beautifully, nearly once a month now, just come together and have these very long conversations about all manner of things. And I think this is what happens when you bring get together two nerds who just love social science, anthropology, all these different sort of things, and seeing current issues through those lenses. So when I was thinking about Alba and how to introduce her, I thought, well, in line with this inquiry around possibility and imagination, what do I think? And one of the first things that attracted me to Alba's work before I knew her, in ye old days of Twitter, is Alba had this incredible ability to offer very hopeful and grounded critique and inquiry, but with this kind of scathing in the most positive way of getting to extremely practical things to do about it. So Alba was often the first person I would look for when I went on Twitter because I wanted to know what Alba was thinking about things, which I don't know if I've actually ever talked to you about that before. But Alba just has these amazing takes of bringing together incredible complexity, and being able to offer it up in a deeply, deeply practical and very generous way. So that's the first thing I think about when I think about Alba. And then Tasha, and then I'll go to you both to be able to introduce your work and your organizations as well, who I also feel very privileged to know. Again, I can't remember when I first met you or started to hear about your work. It's one of those things that you get to know someone and it feels like forever. But Tasha is, so Alba's in America, Tasha's here in Australia with us, so-called Australia. And my connection to Tasha comes through the work of the Accountable Futures Collective, which Tasha will talk about in a minute, but also through our work with young people, and our passion for moving beyond youth participation and youth voice into what it means to be accountable to young people and actually imagine different futures with and by young people. So that's where that comes from. And when I thought about what were the sort of key things that came up for me when I thought about Tasha, the words were possibility and expansion. And I know, Tasha, one of your favorite words is possibility. And Tasha is someone who always challenges me. For anybody out there who might know me, I can be a grump, an absolute grump at the worst of times. And I am someone who likes to see sort of the shadow side of things. And sometimes I feel like Tasha is the yin to my yang, where we both deeply understand each other's worldview and perspective, but Tasha has this incredible way of bringing the light, and the possibility of where we're going, and is just such an incredible leader, in so many different ways. So that's my introduction to both of you, but I'm now going to go to each of you to be able to introduce yourself, challenge me if there was anything I said that you don't like, and talk a little bit about why you're here today. So we'll go to Alba first. So the first question here for you, Albert, is could you share a bit about you from your perspective and who you are and the work that you do?
Oh, thanks so much for that lovely introduction, Morgan. I need a copy of that to like remind myself of, oh, this is how people see me. This is great.
Yeah.
So hi everyone. My name is Alba Villamil. So I work for a company in the US called HmntyCntrd, where I work as a design researcher. And by design researcher, I mean that I help organizations kind of design their products, their services, and policies. So some examples of my work include working with social media platforms to reduce racism in their algorithms, working with welfare agencies to design services for families in kinship care, and working with companies to design emergency employee wellness policies in light of sudden political trauma. So I'm kind of all over the place working with a lot of different types of communities and different types of organizations. But I would say that the kind of main through line in all of these projects is helping organizations and institutions that have a deep legacy of harm to design more kind of trauma-informed and equitable experiences for the vulnerable and historically marginalized groups that they interact with. And so, as a design professional, imagination powers our process, which is, I think, why another reason Morgan kind of invited me into this conversation.
Mm. And on that, in that line or in that vein, I guess, but even beyond it, so for me, bringing you in, you're someone that always challenges and stretches my own imagination. And I feel like you do that for a lot of other people too, with the way that you're able to synthesize very complex information. That's part of how I see you. But for you, what does imagination mean to you, and why does it matter to you and your work?
For me, imagination is really a site of interrogation, right? I think
Mm,
something I always say is that as design professionals, we are architects of inequality and trauma through our imaginations. The way that we interpret and design for the realities of the communities that we engage with determines how equitably they can actually navigate the world around them. When you're
mm,
trying to apply for government assistance, but you can't because the frontline workers only speak English, that was because someone like me failed to imagine your problem as meaningful enough to provide a translator. When you scroll social media and you're suddenly hit with images of violence against someone in your community because the app's default is to autoplay all videos, it's because someone like me didn't imagine your trauma as deserving of care. And so, because of this, I really see one of the kind of core responsibilities as a design professional to interrogate and, more importantly, like really make visible the logics
yes.
underpinning the imaginations of the organizations I work with. So who do our design, like, or I should say, who our designs exploit, police, and discriminate against is really rooted in the borders that we imagine as legitimate and who we imagine as deserving of care.
Mm,
And
mm,
so I'm always trying to think about what does our products, our services, our policies, our programming reveal about what an organization or institution thinks about the populations that they work with. And that is the imaginary that we are operating under as professionals.
don't even know what to say. That was so powerful. I'm just like, yes, I hope someone's writing this down. Um, but that bit you say there about because someone failed to imagine your experience, I feel like that's kind of the crux of what we're talking about, isn't it? It's that not only have someone not being able to imagine it, but it's been invisible or erased from the person who's doing the designing, right? So then it opens up all these things around, well, who gets to design, what identities are behind that designing. And then obviously we think a lot about Alba, you and me, and obviously Tasha as well. This is why it's so important to then engage with people with those very identities as part of those design processes, because one designer can only ever be one designer. So it's all of what incorporates through that process. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
and I
how would no, go Alva, go.
Oh, I mean, I was just going to add too, right? Like it's the different imaginaries that we bring as individuals, but also the imaginaries that we buy into, right? Because
Mm.
um uh it benefits us in some ways, right? And I think something, and maybe this is the cynical part of me. I'm also in the shadow work, Morgan. You know that. Like that's where I
We have
operate as
another
well.
grump. Yep.
But I do also think that we can play with imaginaries, like people from different, even folks with lived experience, those who are marginalized. We are always almost treating imagination or social imagination like a toolkit that we can pull from and that can benefit us in certain ways. It can help us strategize for certain projects that we're working on. And so I also like this idea of imagination is not just something that we're born with, and it's not something that's always
Mm,
innate to us, but it's something that we're kind of compiling from different sources and we're playing with it. We're almost like treating it like a quilted product, right? That
mm,
we're kind of like weaving in all of these different threads and patchworks from things that we've experienced and learned in life. So it's not to make it sound really abstract, but it's this
mm.
kind of moving thing
Yeah.
that we kind of like operate in. It's not something that's ever static.
It's so good. And it's often something that needs prompting. I feel like what you're saying there too. We're going to have no problem. I'm already going down a rabbit hole and we're only in the introductions, but like there's something there about that made me think as you were talking, like I was thinking to myself, what is my first memory of having an imaginative thought, like as a young person or a child outside of my own experience, right? And this is where I think it becomes very closely tied in with like storytelling and narrative work because sometimes we need a vehicle in which to imagine otherwise, right? So it might be through music, it might be through art, it might be through film, but something that shows us an otherwise, that then it allows us to imagine for ourselves that something else might be different. So I think for me, the arts is really critical here as well. Beautifully said, Alba. And in what ways are you working? I feel like you've already sort of said this beautifully in the first question around the design work that you do, but in what ways are you working to challenge or expand the collective imagination? Is there anything else you want to sort of say
I
there?
think it's kind of helpful to understand like my positionality, I think, in
Yeah.
this work, right? So, as someone who is usually hired by organizations, and I'm often engaging with people who I don't share lived experience with, a lot of my work kind of focuses on cultivating a space in
Mm,
which the various organizational and community stakeholders can practice what I call like an ethic of imagination. And so for me, this like ethic of imagination at its root is really a curiosity about what is and what could be. But I think more importantly, and to an earlier point that you made, Morgan, it's really this unshakable belief that alternatives exist,
mm,
no matter how impossible or futile change feels, and that our everyday interactions are sites for resistance.
mm,
Resistance doesn't have to be something big and flashy. Imagination is not just something that belongs in a sci-fi movie, right? It is something that can be practiced in the now,
mm,
on Earth, where we are right now.
mm,
And so I'm always thinking of Angela Davis's quote where she says, "You have to act as if it's possible to radically transform the world." And so for me, when I'm working with community members, when I'm working with these institutions, I'm both trying to create a container in which those who are most vulnerable feel like they can reject
mm,
cynicism and risk being
mm,
imaginative, despite how these institutions may have harmed them
mm,
before, while also trying to coach those with more power on how to challenge their internal resistances towards imaginations that differ from their own. Because I think it's not just about policies and power in the traditional sense, but internally, those of us who are maybe not on the margins or we're more fluid in how we move across different margins, we have a lot of internal work that we have to work through in order to provide the container for communities to co-design the futures that they want.
mm. So many threads. I don't know where to go. But I'll maybe anchor into the quote. That's one of my favorite quotes too. And one of the things I love about at the end of that quote, she sort of talks about, and you have to act like it's possible all the time.
Mhm.
And you know how we talk about, hope as a discipline. And you're going to talk about this as like hope as being a discipline, an ethic, and a practice. It's something you actually have to exercise and realize. I love it when you talked about like being able to challenge cynicism. And this is something that I find really difficult in my day-to-day work, and I have to intentionally continue having to go. I think I've fallen down a hole there, and that's okay. I'm going to stay down there for a little while. But what's going to help me stretch my imagination again, and who helps me to get there? when I feel like things are impossible again. So yeah, beautiful, Alba. Thank you so much. So rich. Now I'm going to come to Tasha. So the first question again for you, Tasha, is could you share a bit about who you are, the work that you do, and if there's anything you would like to challenge based on how I described you?
Thank you, Morgan. And thank you for such a beautiful introduction. And also, Alba, that was just beautiful. I forgot for a moment that I'm going to need to speak in a minute. I'm just so enthralled with speaking and writing notes, and it was just absolutely gorgeous. But by way of introduction to me, so my name is Tasha, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm currently got my feet on beautiful Wurundjeri country. But I also call Gadigal country home and want to also acknowledge my elders up on Alba and Manggarai country. I am someone who had to fight for the light, I think that Morgan might have described. I come from a lineage of people who've had to fight for me to have light. And it really informs the work that I do with a new initiative called Accountable Futures Collective, which is all about reimagining the way that systems, services, communities, adults can become relationally, structurally, systemically, tangibly accountable to young people for the role that they have in their lives. And for me, I guess the work that our collective is trying to do is fighting for the right for young people to have light and for the right for young people's imaginations to be respected for the beautiful, creative, amazing essence that they are, and recognize that young people are uniquely well placed in our societies, in our communities to imagine. And, I think we might all know young people in our lives that are really imaginative and creative and also challenge the hell out of us because the way we are thinking about doing things, they're going to challenge and imagine a different way. And I was having this conversation with a neuroscientist a couple months ago, which wild time.
As you do.
So she was saying that, young people are uniquely, neurobiologically well placed to reimagine, and that they're not constrained or encumbered by constrained thinking in the same way that adults are, and that actually young people have access to generative, expansive ideas and creativity in ways that we can all learn from. And so our collective, Accountable Futures Collective, tries to unleash that, I guess.
Yeah. What a way to introduce the work, Tash. And just so struck by the way you brought in your grandmother there around this kind of concept of intergenerational imagining is just such a gift to us all. The way you sort of talked about that there's seeds of imaginations that come down lines over time. It's not and I think the way I sort of thought about it as Alba was talking about it too is it's like there's this infinite opportunity of imagination and we sort of grab certain ones and then we try to figure out how to make them manifest in the reality that we're living in. And so I just want to honor your grandmother as part of this conversation because we have you because you had her and um, just how beautiful is that you get to maintain that light, right? That was probably dimmer, but still held for her in such a fierce way. And it now gets to shine in such an explicit way in you for the benefit of all of us. So thank you. What a beautiful, beautiful way to introduce the work. And what does imagination mean to you and why does it matter?
Oh, well, thank you. And I guess if I pick up on that thread of intergenerational imagination, it makes me think that how we all benefit from our ancestors and that amazing line about where our ancestors' wildest dreams, but also what it means to take up being an ancestor now. What it means for us to imagine the realities that we all want to live in and see, but also imagine the realities that future generations will inherit from us, and how we bring, I don't know, a limitlessness to that, but also a really practical and grounded, and like you said, Alba, not a flashy way of imagining and taking up a responsibility for future generations in small moments about what me to be practically here, making a decision that I think is the right one, whether to buy, I don't know, biodegradable forks for my event or plastic for smallest, the tiniest little things. How can I hold a sense of imagination for what the future world will look like? But I think also then practically for me, imagining is a lot actually about remembering
Mm,
and remembering that the world, the way it is right now, like it wasn't inevitable. It was designed this way,
mm,
design it differently. And remembering also what we were like when we were kids, or what different cultures and collectives and people and the ways that we have lived that maybe we've lost. So how might we remember that? How do we remember to be in our bodies? How do we remember what it's like to have conversations that are hard? And I think that there's so much knowledge in each of us. Like it doesn't have to be this thing that we're grasping for in the future, that actually it's about something
mm,
remembering.
mm,
Um, but I also wanted to bring in this sense of, like, for me, imagination is, it is a refusal also to
mm,
accept that injustice is normal.
mhm,
So that you so eloquently spoke about resistance, Alba, like I feel that too. And it matters because like systems don't just change, through critique. And they also don't just change through sitting around and talking about what it could be. It
mm,
requires both. And so imagination is like, social imagination, bringing those things together, believing that something else is possible, but then, perhaps in play first or in small steps and then working towards bigger, like how we start to enact that reality as something that we're worthy of, a reality that we can actually step into. And in taking up that reality, we are going to like necessarily critique what's already come before. But if we're
mm,
doing that in possible ways, I think for me, imagination encapsulates that kind of dance between I'm critiquing what is here and finding what is possible, and I'm trying to
mm.
hold care for
Both at the
both.
same time. Beautiful. So much in there. I'm trying to just hook on to, there was one thing you said I wanted to open up a bit more, but now I've forgotten. So I'm just going to keep moving. But yeah, that's that thing you say there about, imagination is not just about what I imagine as possible, but what I'd like to imagine as not existing. Like the refusal that I have, and I deeply resonate with this too. So much of my work was in about or in around, I just can't accept the way things are. And it still is that. And then I go, okay, so what's my role in doing something about that? It was the thing you said about the everyday, daily things that we
Mm.
do and how it speaks to something in an imaginative sense. I really love the way you made that really practical. Like, what am I doing now? And there's that, quote that I think is pretty well known. I'm going to completely get it wrong, but it's the one that like, we plant a seed for a tree that grows now, but we'll never personally sit underneath the shade of the leaves. Someone else will. So how can we actually imagine the actions of what we're doing now having implications for other people that we'll never maybe know? In the same way you so beautifully articulated for your grandmother and you. Like in that sort of way, we're thinking they're things that are bigger than us, so much bigger than us in so many ways. Um,
Yeah, and I mean,
how do
and
you?
also
No,
with
go,
like,
go, go. Yeah.
so like, in I loved Perry's description of you before, this like poetry and pragmatism. But I think
Yeah.
sometimes think about the pragmatism, like sometimes this looks like budget line items. Like how are we creating possibility through
That's
like
it.
existing in some really like non-poetic spaces, but
Yes.
holding and taking up that fire with us through those conversations and saying,
Yeah,
actually, here,
yeah.
how do I find the possibility here? How do I imagine this budget or this, I don't know, policy in this
Yes.
moment of imagination? It's not
Yes.
all beautiful and lovely. Sometimes it's really boring.
So important. And I feel like you're a master at this. You probably don't see it in yourself, or maybe you do, where you will take something that was traditionally quite a boring thing to do. And I feel like you kind of put your light into it. It's like, how might we do this differently? And to me, that's a form of radical imagination. It's like we don't necessarily have to make it fun. Sometimes things are just not fun. Let's just accept it. But how might we do it differently, that there's another possibility available to us through imagining how we do that differently? So I just love how, yeah, you thought about that. It's not just the poetry, and we only have room for imagination when we're in an arts class, right? It's like the very pragmatic imagination that we're trying to exercise every day. Yeah, in everything we do. Um, and in what ways are you working to challenge or expand our Have I missed one? No. Why does imagination, what does it matter? How do you create space for it in your life and practice? I think I've missed it because I feel like you already started to do it. You started to talk about the daily habits and the daily things we do. But is there anything else for you in around how you create space for it in your life?
I feel really blessed because I mean it's hard, and I'm not always imaginative, and sometimes I'm also grumpy, and sometimes I'm also like I have to just do this task, but trying to
Yeah.
like bring it in and trying to hold that when I can. But also I am really lucky in that I work with young people a lot, and
Mm,
so I think and you know I work with young people specifically about accountability and what does accountability look like, and
mm,
what are accountability mechanisms that young people want to bring into being, and what is
mm,
the story of accountability that young people are calling for, and how do young people want to be in relationship with each other, but also with adults in their lives, with services and systems in ways that are not accountable like accountability, but like accountability like what do we owe each other? How do we want to be in relationship together? And what are then the structures and mechanisms and services that we want to design in service of those kinds of relationships? So I think for me, like in my life and practice, like young people bring me there all the time. Sometimes kicking and screaming. But yeah, I think like the possibilities that emerge when you ask anybody, perhaps
mm.
especially for me, young people, what's the world you want to live in, and what are you imagining, and what are your aspirations and hopes, as opposed to just what are the problems that you've got going on and how do we solve them together?
Yep.
Actually, what I see become reality,
Mm,
uh, I think means that it's part of my life and practice quite regularly.
absolutely. And I feel like it was like when you talked about that neuroscientist talk too. And
Mm.
there was almost, I don't think you said the word, but I feel like she was referring to almost like a malleability that's so inherent in children and young people, right? And it's that state of fluidness that's way more open. Um, and as we get older, sometimes it's like that starts to shrivel up. How do we keep it malleable as much as possible and put ourselves in the way of people who challenge us to get to keep going there? Um, and yeah,
Yeah,
children and young people just do it so effortlessly because it's just part of, I think sometimes a bit of their state of being. Yeah.
yeah, and just seeing the world like often, you know, we are perhaps at our most creative as adults too when we're seeing something for the first time or engaging with something
Yeah.
for the time, because we're really like nervous and you know all caught up in all the "Ooh," but also you the time when you ask why the most, like why is it
Mm.
done this? You know, when you come to a new workplace or a new community, you're like, oh, what? How is this happening? And your mind is expanding, but also you're at your most generative. And I feel like young people are seeing a lot of things perhaps for the first time. And so are in
Yeah.
that the time. But I think
Yeah.
for you know, adults, like we sometimes get stuck into, yeah, like this is the way things get done. And when we engage with community members or young people, we'll support their capability building so that they can come to learn how we do things. As
Yeah.
you know, like how do we build our capability to learn how they
Love
want to
it.
do things? And you know, that could go for governance or language
Mm.
or policies. Um, and so, yeah, I think like continuing to practice what it's like to stay in that kind of state helps it become more real for me.
That's so good. And I love how you sort of tipped capability on its head. There's a whole rabbit hole there, but um, that exact thing you say, it's one imagining, dominant imagining about capability, whose capability are we valuing there, and then saying other people have to meet that level of capability. What about the capability they're offering to us that we don't have? So where's the mutual capability building there too? There's just such an inherent power in saying this person needs this kind of capability for this and us. It's making me think of recently there was a young person I was talking with, and we were sort of fleshing some things out together around talking about impact of this particular initiative, right? And I was talking about, the importance of skill building, because that's something that some of the young people had talked to me about that was really important to them, building their skills. But this particular young person was like, yeah, look, the skills are fine, but that's not why I came here. I came here because I wanted things to change, and it just brought me straight back into that what's important to me and to the program and to the initiative and to the organization. But for that young person, it was something isn't right around here. And that's it. That's all I know. And I just need to do something about it. If I have to learn skills, but I already have skills, I've come with skills. So help me use them, so it really brings me back to that. Um,
Mm.
and then the final question for now, just the intro question. In what ways are you working to challenge or expand our collective imagination? And I feel like you beautifully talked about that in the first question around your work and your life. But is there anything else that you want to tease out there about the ways that you're doing it already all the time?
I think perhaps just the only other thing I would have to offer is around like accountability has become very important to me as a concept because it
Mm,
is like how we want to be in relationship with each other and how we want to articulate what it is that we owe each other and how we want to stay in that together and including when things get difficult. So I'd
mm,
say that our collective is trying to work at the pace of trust and not just the pace of alignment. Like, yes,
mm,
it's great when we agree and you want this and I want this and oh amazing, let's do something together. As opposed to like you want this and I want this and do we trust each other yet? Like and
mm.
and we can we work together when we trust each other to say, hey, I disagree with you, or we've actually realized that my imagination of this thing that you say you want and your imagination of this thing I said I want is different.
Are at
What's
odds?
going to hold us together and what's going to hold
Mm,
us in that work practically.
mm,
And when I think
mm.
about sort of institutions and then communities and the ways that we want to try and get quickly into alignment so we can quickly do something, as
Yes.
opposed to let's find what it is that we want to do together and then we build trust until we're ready to go.
Mm,
Like that we're attempting to gently challenge that and that has all kinds of implications for like timelines and
yes.
costs and resources and conversations and
Mm,
things. Really it's about like how do we find the right trust with each other and acknowledge the power and acknowledge the reasons why we don't trust each other yet so that
yes.
then we find ways to move forward in
And I
trust.
feel like you've really powerfully illustrated there again the practicality of imagination because, when we think about systems thinking, we think about mindsets, hearts and minds. But you really beautifully illustrated there that it happens every day in just how we're always knocking up against each other because mindsets are a form of imagining, right? So it's like, well, I'm imagining this task like this, you're imagining it like that. I see it a lot through the way people sort of embody particular values, based on their identity, their worldview, so many other things. Well, this is what that means to me. Doesn't it mean that to you? No, that's not what that means to me at all. So I think that just that both that interplay and that friction that's always coming up is actually part of what we're imagining. But we probably would never call it imagination, we call it mindsets.
And that like that when you get to that point of like oh we're not the same, like not being like that magnet
Mm,
boing, like now we can't be in a relationship or now we can't work or that Adrienne Marie Brown, like also like that sense of loving correction, like how do we stay in it together and move through the fact that you've imagined something differently to I have.
yeah. Uh, you're just bringing me, I'm not going to remember it and I'm going to get really annoyed, but there's this really good Vicky Reynolds quote and it's about how we stay in kind of almost constructive tension or constructive friction. She's got this beautiful term for it, as she always does. So I'll try and find it maybe later on when I'm not in the zone. But it's exactly that. Like when I'm moving towards you and you're moving towards me, and then also there's all of a sudden something that makes us sort of reel back a bit. How do we come back in again? Rather than keeping going further and further and further apart. It's so beautifully said. Wow. All right. Now we're going to get into the body of that's the introductions. I think we're finished now. Everybody can go. Now, so now we're going to get into the body of the questions, the sort of really meaty part of the sandwich here. And this is where it's a little less, Tasha Alba. It's just going to be, we're all just going to sort of weigh in. But we do have some sort of anchoring questions where we're going to start, and we're just going to start somewhere and see where we go. And the wonderful Ali and Perry are going to make sure we don't go too far down rabbit holes and waste everyone's time. So the first question or sort of concept or theme here is about power and the collective imagination. So the framing around this is sort of systems of power are sustained not only by policy and practice, which I think both Tasha and Alba you've said, but by imagination, by dominant ideas of what's possible, normal, and desirable. So we live in worlds imagined by other people every day. And what does it take to carve out our own space where we're actually living in our own sense of what that is? So some of the prompting questions here that I'll open up, but then I'm just going to open up to wherever we want to go. You know, whose imaginations are we living in? Something I'm really interested in is how do we know when we're coming up against another imagination? What are some of the signals that we start to feel, sense that, oh, I'm not quite, you know, that thing you talk about, Tasha, oh, what's that? And I'm coming a bit further away. Or, oh, yes, yes, I'm coming closer and closer. You know, that's feeling really good. How does power shape and constrain our collective imagination and of what's possible? And what would it mean to center imaginations that have historically been dismissed or erased? Or very commonly, what we talk about as being on the margins. And one of the things that comes to me here is that I don't know, again, I'm a nerd. I like quotes. It's just the way I anchor my thinking. But it's something about, you know, one of the most dangerous quotes ever is this is the way we've always done things around here, you know? So it's like this concept of you walk into a place and all of a sudden there's for me, it feels like a contraction. Yeah. And all of a sudden, the ways that I would usually move, I'm not allowed to move in those ways anymore because I'm feeling under duress to some degree. And then I'm starting to look around to see how other people are performing, you know, or what kind of imagination is possible in a space. So, yeah, just to open that up to Alba, Tasha, for you with that sort of power and collective imagination, what's possible, normal, desirable? How do we know what imaginations we're in? Um, Anything that struck you there that you'd like to sort of take the thread on and go with? Alba.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that Tasha was talking about that really resonated with me were the stories of accountability. And I think
Mm,
we can kind of identify when we are operating in others' imaginations and when those imaginations differ from ours. And that's revealed through the stories of accountability and what we want to owe each other.
mm,
Um, Something that I've come across a lot in my work is, you know, when we're designing programming or services or products for, you know, historically marginalized groups, I often find that the organizations that I'm working with are using a rhetorical move that I call like a deficiency model of
mm-hmm,
behavior, right? And that's where when they're describing people's needs and the problems that need to be solved, right? They're often describing these folks as uninformed, non-compliant,
mm,
unskilled, trustful, disorderly, undisciplined, right? Irresponsible, right? There's all of these like very deeply coded words that indicate that
mm,
they don't feel accountable to these communities in a way that they should.
mm,
So what I'm often looking at is what is the language that we are using
mm,
that allows us not to have to take accountability and offer solutions that actually address people's needs and like
mm,
design the futures that they want. So how can we make things individualized versus something that reflects the institution and the systems that it is embedded in and it is maintaining? So I always start off with when I'm working with a client, trying to get at how they're framing a question, and the problem that needs to be solved here, because that often reveals a lot of how the imagination in that organization is operating.
That's powerful. And just even that very, very pragmatic and practical way that I think we do think, pulling it down into the practice there is interrogating coded language. And I found this in lots of spaces too. Even just that act of slowing people down and going, hang on a minute, I'm just going to catch you with that word we've just used. What does that mean to you? And what is the way that you're describing it? Let's unpack that a bit more. And it's making me think of a group I worked with quite a few years ago who very intentionally, as part of their activism, would show up with a government department who started to whitewash a lot of language that started to disappear and erase the harm, and then use the language that actually put the harm back to be center. And it was amazing how those officials were deeply uncomfortable by that happening. And just even the act of interrogating why we use certain words and starting to shift to use other words has these visceral reactions in systems, right? So just, yeah, that really
Yeah, and
resonated for me as you said that.
like an example of that from one of my own projects. I remember one of my clients asked, their blue sky question was, how do we increase user enthusiasm for signing up for our government service? And I was like, okay, how about we reframe that
Yeah.
question? Ask, how has this government agency, racist policies, and frontline workers impacted users' enthusiasm, right?
Mm,
Rather than putting the onus on communities and individuals to change because they just need to be more educated or they need to be a better
mm,
version of themselves. How are we actually kind of keeping in mind institutional memory here and how this
yes.
institution has interacted with these communities beforehand? Because people respond, what is it? Like behavior is a language, right? So people respond to what has been done to them because the
Yes.
institution is communicating how it feels about these communities.
And Tasha, I feel like this brings us back to that when you talked about, I can't remember exactly what you said. Oh, that's right. It was here I am, here you are. We want to do something together rather than here I am, here you are. Do we trust each other yet? And I
Mm,
feel like Alba's just beautifully articulated that with rather than them starting from that, they're starting from we have a service, you are the user. Why aren't you using the service? Not you are a person, we have a system. Why haven't you trusted our system historically? What might we have done wrong? So that even just that flips the imagination and the framing, doesn't it?
totally. I mean, um, I loved everything that was just being said, especially around the language and something that has started to give me the like with the languages around words that seem really caring, but
Mm,
aren't caring.
hmm.
So things like we're going to empower people, or we're going
Yes.
to help communities, or we're going to
Yes.
like even support sometimes, as opposed to like work alongside and
Hmm.
partner and care about people.
Mm,
And I have come to have a little less trust when we want to empower particular groups of people to do a particular thing,
yes.
unless that group has called for that and we're acting in service. And
Mm,
I'll put a quote in the chat that I have up on my wall and guides me. And whenever I've come to it at different stages of my life, I feel like I take something different from it each time, from Annie
mm,
Lilla Watson. I
I knew you were going to say this one. I was like, I bet you it's Lila. Yep.
if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And
Mm,
I think for me, at this time, I resonate with the second part of that sentence around if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine. If you have come because you are seeking to reimagine in the same way that I'm seeking to reimagine, and we're going to reimagine perhaps different things, but we're coming together to reimagine, like to imagine together, as opposed
mm,
to you coming here to help me with something that you think I
yes.
need, or
Mm,
help me become more like you, like become more
yes.
than wants me to be. I
Yes.
think the idea that we are humans that all need liberation in this moment from something, and how do
Mm,
we come together to acknowledge that? And I
beautiful.
guess to your question earlier, Morgan, around like how do I know when we're in someone else's imagination? I think, Annie Lilla Watson like guides me in that, but also this sense of like power shaping imagination by narrowing the horizon. And
Mm,
I feel like I'm in a space where like I want to be more expansive, but the system or folks with a lot of positional power are saying like this isn't possible and this is why we need to narrow. I'm not saying like let's not be narrow for projects and
of
like let's
course. Yeah, yeah.
down and like let's be clear, but where we have narrowed the sense of what we can hope for, uh,
Mm,
I feel like we're living in someone else's imagination.
mm.
Um, so that for me like sends off spidey signals. Like, oh, I don't
I
know if this is
love I love how you sort of put language to that when we narrow the sense of what we can hope for. That's very powerful to me. Like I felt that in my body, when we're trying to bring it back to the embodied state, that feels really embodied. And bringing it sort of back to when we think about process and the ways that these things are enacted or not enacted every day, it's sort of for folks who might be designers in the audience, we kind of have this thing called divergence and convergence, right? We diverge out and out and out, and then we come in and in and in. And I kind of like when you were talking about Tasha, that's where my mind went, is who gets to decide when we start to close, who gets to decide when we converge. And you probably had this, I've had this all the time. We're in a space and someone goes, all right, well, now what are we going to do about it? And that's fine. It's not that that's wrong. It's that when we're thinking about sort of how that invisible power moves, who gets to decide how far out we diverge, who gets to decide where the boundaries of the system are, who gets to decide where the boundary of that discussion are, right? And then they overlay that on everybody else.
Sorry, I'm getting too excited.
Go for it.
Just like who gets to hold the process gets to hold the power, right?
Mhm.
Like even in community settings, or even when we're engaging in organizations, or like if you're holding process, you're holding power. And I think that for many folks who have experienced marginalization, you know what it's like to live in and respond to someone else's imagination all the time.
Yes. And to survive within
And
it.
to survive, totally. And then to sometimes be offered a co-design opportunity as how we want to reshape things feels really limiting.
Mm,
The process and the power of the process is still being held by folks who've got not necessarily even predetermined outcomes sometimes, but predetermined timelines. And
mm,
asking me to imagine with you or hope with you
mm,
or create something new with you so that your service is going to work better for me, but
mm,
you're going to retain all the power in the process.
mm.
Like, we're not coming to this in ways that are going to enable imagination.
It's like it's almost that thing, who draws the borders, right? In all different sort of contexts. And that was just me using as an example there as someone who does do a lot of design myself, because that is something I often think about, is who gets to decide when we converge? Who gets to decide, who gets to decide, who gets to decide. Before I move on to the next bit, Alba, anything else you want to add on that before we come into because I feel like Tasha's taking us into embodiment and the limits, but you let me know if there's anything else you want to add.
Let's just go into embodiment. Go for it.
Okay, let's do it. So I feel like you were starting to touch on it there. I can't remember what you said, Tasha, but sort of this next bit that we were going to start thinking about, and you brought this up for us to start thinking about, which is embodiment and the limits of imagination. So imagination doesn't always come easily, especially in times of trauma, exhaustion, or survival. Our bodies hold the stories of both constraint and possibility. So some of the things we're thinking about here is, how does the body support or limit our access to imagination? And what happens to creative capacity when we're in distress? And how might recovery and healing make more room for imaginative work? And, this is something I'm extremely passionate about. I know we all are. But, even the invitation to ask someone to imagine beyond their immediate circumstances can be very painful. Particularly when they've had imagination taken from them. And like when you've talked about, Tasha, I'm forced to live in another imagination to survive. You asking me to imagine outside of that boundary puts my body into threat, because I had to shut that capability in myself down to survive. So yeah, just interested, maybe Tasha, you take us here and then we'll go to Alba, because I know that this is something you think about a lot, if you
Thanks,
want
Morgan.
to.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's an amazing invitation. I can't see the audience, which is also a bit hectic.
It's
But
so weird, isn't it?
it's true. But sometimes when we talk about the body in different systems or spaces, it gets really uncomfortable quite quickly. People go like, "Oh, what am I asked to be an embodied, like in a body right now?" And there are other cultures and spaces and people who are like very like body first. I can't
Yeah.
attend this conversation until I'm in my body. And then a whole lot of people are like, swimming in the middle, like me, where I'm sometimes like completely taken over by my body. And
Mm,
sometimes I'm like, oh, okay, I actually need to attend to what's going on for it. But
mm,
I think that like each of us, whether we have lived in survival and therefore being asked to imagine feels like a threat, or whether we've lived in relative comfort and we're being told, hey, your relative comfort has caused harm to others.
mm,
Like, each of those are unique but difficult bodily experiences.
mm,
And like, I tend to believe that we don't heal in isolation, that we
mm,
heal in community with other people. I
mm,
think perhaps for me, imagination is also a collective endeavor. Like, how
Yep.
do we be in that together? But
Mm,
also recognizing that like each individual body is going to be responding in particular ways that we can't ever know.
mm,
And how we set up spaces and conversations and engagements that allow people to have the spaciousness to attend to their body, whether it is I'm realizing I've been comfortable and therefore we've all been living in an imagination I'm quite comfy with and it's not working for others and I feel guilty about that or I feel
mm,
uncomfortable about that,
mm,
or whether it's like, oh, this is really triggering something for me at this moment because I know what it's like to feel the harm or I know what
mm,
it's like to not have choice.
mm.
I think I don't have any answers. I have a lot of questions about this, about how we create
Yes.
spaces to allow us to attend to our bodies
Yeah,
um,
it's beautiful.
in this work.
And something also about when you talk about imagination as remembering,
Mm.
sometimes when we open capacity for imagination, remembering can flood in. So how do we also create space and tending to people as they're remembering things? Because not all those things are nice to remember, or to process something that maybe is coming down a lineage that's not even my memory, but I'm remembering it for someone else who couldn't. That sort of there's just so much in that around body.
I
Was there,
remember
yeah, go on.
working
You
with
want to say something?
um,
And then I'll go to Alba.
I just remember working with this group who were working with young people who, like, at the end of every session, they would put up a list of support numbers and say, if you need anything after the session, if it's brought up anything for you, like, let us know. And
Mm,
then it did. And everyone went, oh, like, oh, we
mm,
actually, I know that we were as
mm,
prepared as we wanted to be somebody who's actually having an embodied experience and wants to speak about it. So I guess for
mm.
me, it's like, how can we all in our practice in this work towards imagination also think about that it's an embodied imagination in
So
that way?
beautiful. Because we so constantly design things for disembodiment or in disembodied ways. Alba, what's going on for you? You want to jump in?
Yeah, it's making me think that if safety kind of like starts at this like somatic and nervous system level, it's creativity then requires us to kind of create the conditions for which someone's window of tolerance for risk
Yes.
widens.
Mm,
And you know, it's thinking about like what is a safe stretch in this room. And so sometimes when we're asking for folks to engage in imagination, it's also like being able to kind of anticipate what could be possible in this room at this time,
mm,
given what we know about people in the room, right? Like, again, what is that safe stretch in this room,
mm.
this moment? And that could be something that we thought was something else before we enter the room. And so then how do we as facilitators of this experience be able to identify when have we stretched too far, what's causing
Yes.
pain, and when do we need to kind of relax and recenter?
Mm, mm,
And just being able to be comfortable with seeing that, acknowledging that, and responding to that. Because I think
mm,
sometimes we can get in our heads of, oh, we need to hit these particular deadlines. So we need to, in this session, we have to be able to accomplish this. But there's a sort of bravery to be able to identify when that window of tolerance has been violated. And we need to
mm,
get braver at naming that and responding to that. The other thing that kind of comes to mind to me is something that I've been working on in some of the groups that I've been working with is thinking about like how can we do prep work to almost kind of stretch someone's emotional endurance. I'm always talking about like I hate the word resilience because I think it often implies that bad things happen to us and we have to bounce back like as if nothing had ever happened to us. And so I love this idea of kind of rethinking how we show up in terms of endurance, right? It's the long game, it's sustainability, it's being able to keep more even. So, like when bad things happen to us, we're still able to kind of navigate that, right?
mm,
And so sometimes for some clients, like we'll actually do training for emotional endurance, right? So it's like, how do you kind of um, enhance someone's sense of self-awareness, right? That they're able to identify that they're feeling something in their body.
mm.
What is that and how should they respond? Can we actually encourage people to kind of develop what I call like empathetic boundaries, right? And that's kind of like the ability to distinguish what you're feeling from what other people are feeling in the room so that what they're feeling doesn't necessarily negatively impact you or
Mm,
overwhelm you by being surrounded by that. How do we emotionally regulate, right? And most importantly, like, how do we just practice self-compassion in these
mm,
spaces? Sometimes we're going to be asked to engage in imagination and it's just not working, right? And so, how can we be kinder to ourselves and not see getting triggered or getting dysregulated or not
mhm,
being able to show up 100% like you want to as a failure? It is just
mhm,
like something that we need to accept by about ourselves, and we're going to continue on. Those are all skills. Those are all things that like
mm,
we can practice
mm,
and should be practicing every day. So I've been kind of thinking more around like there's the space that we're doing this work in, and then there's kind of the prep work to help
mm,
people enter that space
mm,
in the best way that they possibly can before we start the work.
mm. So powerful, Alba. And that thing you sort of bring us to right at the beginning, it was like when to learn to identify when that window of tolerance is being violated. And when someone's particular nervous system starts to dominate the space. Well, I can stretch safely to here. Why can't you?
Mhm.
Right? Instead of like where I have to read the room and be responsive to a collective nervous system as well, right? We don't go, if someone's not quite there, we don't go a lot without them, you know? And I think that also brings back to Tasha's thing about we collectively heal, we heal in relationship with. And it might be very small, gentle things over time. Versus, well, I healed this way, so should you, which then becomes a dominant imagination again. Um, as I knew we would, we are already at question time. I'm so heartbroken. I am so upset. There is so many different places I still want to go, but I am going to hand back over to Ali and to Perry. And there might be some questions in the audience where we can have a bit more of a conversation, but we never have enough time. That's one of that's my imagination right now. Yeah.
Never enough time, and we could absolutely continue all evening, although Alba, I think it must be going on 3 a.m. for you. So maybe not all
Yes.
evening.
It's 3:45 a.m. where I am right now.
Oh.
We so appreciate the reflections and the practices and the provocations that you're sharing. There's a question that's come in pretty early on, and thank you, Caitlin, for the careful framing of this. And Caitlin is reaching out to ask, how can I continue to hold on to optimism and remain future focused in this work when so much of my energy is directed towards mitigating harm rather than driving proactive change? And I think this question gets to something that we've talked about with Morgan, and Morgan's thinking around how imagination isn't just like a personal gift, it's a collective ethic. So how do we kind of like nurture this, return to this? Alba, you were just talking about endurance. So how do we kind of build this optimism as individuals, as groups, collectively? I'm gonna open it, Morgan, if you'd like to respond as well, to you and to Alba and to Tasha.
I'm going to pass to Tasha and Alba because I feel like I've done way too much talking. So, and then I will come in at the end if there's anything else.
I'll jump in first, Tasha. I don't know if you mind. Okay, cool. So I think one of the things that I've tried to do in my research teams, when I'm working kind of with like a group of folks, is like before we start a project, we often talk about what is our um, care plan. And by that, we mean like what are the systems of care that we're going to be building to kind of take us through this process, as well as what are the kind of personal actions that we are going to commit to in order to, again, exercise that discipline of hope that Morgan had talked about at the very beginning. And so by
Mm,
systems of care, I'm often talking about things like accountability, recognition, and transparency, right? And because I think oftentimes those are um, kind of like values that we let go at the wayside, like when
mm,
we're doing this work. And so as a team, like how can we practice that? So for
mm,
example, in terms of recognition, let's say that someone had like a banger of a workshop, like with community members. How are we recognizing that as a team? Because when we actually spend time recognizing the positivity of this, the momentiveness of this, like the way that this actually like challenge the imaginaries of the institutions that we're working in, like that gives people something to cling on to. Because we
Mm,
can't just get into this mode of like what's called like radical rigidism, right? Like I think sometimes um, I've just recently started reading the book Militant Joy, and so I've
mm,
this idea of how sometimes we're very hard on ourselves as practitioners who are trying to change systems. And so, how can we be militant about actually attaching ourselves to and recognizing our joys and our successes in the work?
mm,
Another book that kind of dovetails into this is Rebecca Solnit's Hope in the Dark, where she just lists all of these different things that like this should give us hope because these are all the things that we've been able to achieve.
mm,
So again, like one of the things I would just I always advocate for, like when we're starting a project, is how are we going to take care of ourselves as a team? Again, how are we going to create those systems of transparency, recognition, and accountability among ourselves? And then how are we going to commit to like a self-care regimen that we are, and I say regimen because it's something that we have to actively create and follow to the team
mm.
in order for us to care about ourselves. Happy to dive into what a care plan can look like a little bit later on, but I want to pass it over to Tosh.
That's beautiful, Alba. Go
Thank
for
you,
it,
Alba.
Tasha.
I don't know that I have much to offer you, Caitlin, beyond that. Perhaps other than to say that I think holding on to optimism and future focus by supporting those around you to mitigating harm for each other is it. Like I think that is imagining something different in the moment. And I
Mm,
guess I subscribe to a fractal kind of belief in systems change, that if we ourselves can demonstrate a different way of being with one another, and we can continue to bravely go where we know that harm occurs and seek to offer something different in solidarity with one another, in real care for one another, in like a real radical transparency that this is not easy and that these systems have perpetuated harm, or this institution is really, has a history that is not great, but we are going to be here and attempt to offer something different. And that offering does not have to look like speaking to the board or creating the new strategy. It can look like we care for one another differently. Like I think that I remain optimistic if you are in harmful environments,
mm,
people.
mm. The only thing additional I'll add to that is that it's the micro moments of joy, connection, and imagination that are happening even amongst the harm. I think that sometimes I wonder if sometimes we look at it like a binary. The harm's here and then the healing's over here. And so often we know it's so entangled, and it's so how do I find those moments in the work when that's happening instead of outside of the work as something extra that I hope to attain and get to that never comes. So that's just been that's something I grapple with all the time too. Yeah.
Thank you all so much. We might alternate between some of the questions and answers that are coming through in the official question and answer portal, and some of the ones that are coming through in the chat. Perry, did you have one that was catching your attention?
Yeah, there's one coming through in the chat, and I think we've addressed it in some ways, but it's quite pointedly expressed. So it'd be nice to get your comments on everyone in the panel. Keen to hear reflections on how we inspire bureaucrats and government more broadly to get inspired and imagine and then take steps towards a better future. How do we hold them accountable for this often harmful reality that we've arrived at? I think it's an excellent question. It's so much of the work, isn't it? Morgan, would you like to start with a reflection on that? I know you do a lot of work with
Yeah.
folk in government.
Can you just yeah, is this the one I'm just looking at it myself because sometimes I need to read it visually. Is it the one that says I often come across that you're living in La La Land comment? Is it the one?
No, this one's
No?
come from the chat, Morgan. from
Okay,
Joanna. I can read it again for you. I'm keen to hear
please.
reflections on how we inspire bureaucrats and government more broadly to get inspired to imagine and then take steps towards a better future. How do we
Mm.
hold them accountable for the often harmful reality we've arrived at?
I'll say something briefly
It
and then
could
I
be,
might come to, yeah, to Tasha and then to Alba. Jethro's actually put a great comment in the chat, which is the role of authentic messengers is so important in the changing of imaginaries from bureaucrats and government. Someone like you has to tell you it's okay to change. That actually, in my experience, is the very first thing is we are allowed to imagine differently in this space together. How do we actually get people even just to that? Sometimes that can be years of work just to get to that question. Just to get, I think, Albert, it comes back to your concept about the malleability. You can go there so immediately with some people in some communities and young people, right? And for other people, it's like, what do we eat? We don't have time to think about that question here, right? There's all these thresholds that you have to move to even to get to the imagining. But yeah, I might pass over to Tasha and Alba as well.
Thank you. I mean, it's such a big question. I think about it a lot. I guess I think about something that Alba you shared at the very beginning around like honoring how like the complexities that we walk into rooms with, and thinking about how we prepare to be in rooms together. A lot of my work is with adults and young people, or institutions and governments and organizations, and then young people who experience the impact of the decisions that get made for them. And we can just smush people into a room together and it's just going to go badly. So then it's like, okay, well, let's not do that. What are we going to do first? How are we going to prepare one another so that we can, I guess, embody this idea that like new experiences will create new mindsets? And we need to have new experiences to spark perhaps different imaginations and different imaginings. And we need to be in community and relationship with new people if imagination is a collective thing. But if I take a step back, like we can't have new experiences and all the new mindsets and all the goodness and amazingness if we can't be in the room together. And part of, I think, how we be in the room together is acknowledging that harm has happened. Like when we've asked lots of young people about like what accountability means to them. They describe it as not just reactive and not just at the end of a process or not just when something's gone wrong, but also proactively what do we owe each other? And also acknowledging that harm has happened, that like it's okay to say like something's gone wrong here. We're not in right relationship with each other, not just as individuals, but as cohorts, as collectives. Like perhaps government isn't in right relationship with some communities. We can acknowledge that and do some preparation work separately to then perhaps come together for new experiences. So that's what I am trying to learn into at the moment. That's what I would have to say at this time.
Yeah, and I want to plus one on this idea of like doing that preparation work again, right? And one of the things that I've experimented with clients is what's called de-gamification. And so it comes from this queer scholar named Bo Ruberg. And one of the things that they note is just how game-like systemic inequality operates, right? But if you actually present these systems as a game, that these like bureaucrats can see if they can solve for and de-gamify to understand what are those rules, what are the things that have been normalized, like what are the things that are like assumptions about the way that their work actually operates. There's like this really interesting moment where people recognize, oh, things are not actually set in stone. And a lot of the ways that inequality, uh, you know, is created in these systems are based off of people's discretion. It's not actually like in policy. It's not actually official that they have to do things in a certain way. And so if you can give them like a tool to see how the systems that they are upholding are being upholded because of their own discretion, their own like assumptions that they're making. There's this like moment where they recognize, like they can see that they have an imagination here and that they are the ones that are propping it up. Of course, there are certain things that are set in stone because they're law, but law is usually only a guide for how governments actually
Mm,
work. We're actually making very usually people are making decisions that they don't have to create more red tape than actually exists. So yeah, finding ways to kind of reveal the way that the game is played in these systems, I think is often like a really interesting and helpful first step to get people like awoken, I guess, to make a role
Yes.
in it, right?
I love
So
that. Just that the only thing I'll add sort of there is just the enacting, like helping people understand that they're always enacting imagination through the micro decisions they make every day. What you're
Mhm.
talking about there, Alba. Then the only other thing I'll add is you're never alone. So I think sometimes we can have this like heropreneur, I'm the one in this system on my own doing this. Who are my solidarity mates? Vicky Reynolds talks about who am I howling at the moon people? You're not alone. And so, how do you find those people both within the system you're in and outside of it to keep you going and to remember that you're not just one person up against everything else? Sorry, Ali, jump in.
no, not at all. With 3 minutes remaining, this feels like a bad moderator move. But there's a couple questions that have come in around like, do you have conflict in the care plan? And what do you do when there's conflict? How do you help people see that there's cognitive dissonance between how they're feeling, their values and how they're behaving? So that values misalignment. And there's like, how do you help people recognize that they are part of the system? And so I think to just briefly ask, and just sorry to put you on the spot, but Alba and Tasha, is there something that helps you personally recognize that you are part of the systems that you're working within as a way of trying to address these multiple questions that have come in that feel too good to leave unattended? Alba, is it okay if we start with you? Oh, Tasha's off mute first. Quick draw. Yep, go for
Just
it.
go for this pressure with 1 minute, and there's really amazing questions and so much to say. I guess perhaps it's the only offering I could give in 30 seconds is like gentle. How do we be like a little more gentle with each other and ourselves? Like we are swimming in the waters of the dominant systems. Like it's in all of us, and so it's in everyone we meet, and it's okay. It's not okay, but it's okay. Like, how do we find that in each other and be like, in solidarity with each other does not mean we're like all happy best friends all the time. It means that we're in solidarity, like, we're going to hold each other to these things that we care about and the values we want to have. But we're not going to be perfect all the time. So just, I think, a little more gentleness and gently bringing people to realizations. And yeah, I guess that age-old thing about like gentle on people so we can need to be hard on systems.
I'm sorry, like that's an amazing quote to end off with. So I'm just going to leave it there, Tosh.
Absolutely, absolutely brilliant quote to end off with. We'll be sending a recap of some of the themes that have come up in this session, all of the links that have been shared in the chat. There's been some great resources, multiple quotes referred to, and we'll be putting in people's names. And I believe Alba's mentioned a bit of a care plan. So after a good solid 8 hours sleep, we'll get back to Alba and ask for resources to build a care plan, because I think there'll be a lot of that happening here in Australia after this conversation. It has been such a rich, thoughtful, beautiful conversation. We have lots of things coming in the chat. This is the third and final of the speaker series, and we're having one more, what we're calling an after party, because like Tasha mentioned, we can't see all out there, and that's really weird. And we want to be able to be in conversation together. So Perry and I are going to host one last open Zoom session. We'll put another link amongst all of the things coming in the chat, and we'll send this in an email to everyone that's registered as well. So if you're watching the recording, it's hopefully not too late. Join us live. And thank you so much for joining us all. And thank you again to all of our speakers. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
And everyone for having us.
Everyone.